The piercing screams of Penelope Nelson sliced through the dusty afternoon air of Medicine Bow, Wyoming, drawing curious glances from passers-by, who quickly averted their eyes when they spotted three burly men dragging the struggling young woman toward the rusty nail saloon. The year was 1878, and in this corner of the Wyoming Territory, folks had learned to mind their own business, especially when Jeb Parker and his brothers were involved. "Let me go. I've done nothing to deserve this," Penelope cried, her honey-brown hair falling loose from its pins as she twisted against the iron grip on her arms. The fine cotton of her pale blue dress was already smudged with dirt from being manhandled down the town's main street. "Your pa owes us, and you're gonna work it off," growled the oldest Parker brother, his whiskey-soured breath hot against her face. "One way or another." Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs. Just 2 hours earlier, she had been peacefully arranging merchandise in her father's general store. Now she was being hauled into the most notorious establishment in Medicine Bow, a place no respectable woman would enter willingly. "My father would never agree to this. Whatever debt you claim, we can discuss it properly." She dug her heels into the dirt, but the men merely lifted her, her feet dangling helplessly above the ground. Inside the saloon, the usual afternoon crowd of card players, drinkers, and working girls paused momentarily at the commotion before returning to their business. The piano player never missed a beat, his jaunty tune providing a macabre soundtrack to Penelope's predicament. "Old man Nelson's been ducking us for months," said the second Parker brother, shoving a chair aside. "Time's run out." From the corner of the room, a man looked up from his solitary drink. Mason Xavier had been in Medicine Bow for less than a week, and he'd made it a point to keep to himself. Tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that brushed his collar, he wore the dust of the trail and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to trouble. The worn leather holster on his hip housed a Colt revolver that had seen its share of use. Mason watched as the woman struggled against her captors, noting the genuine fear in her eyes and the cruel grins on the men's faces. He'd seen plenty of saloon girls feigning resistance for show, but this was different. This woman didn't belong here. "Please," Penelope pleaded, catching the eye of the saloon owner. "Mr. Decker, you know my father. He's an honest man." The portly saloon owner wiped his hands on his apron and shrugged. "Ain't my business what you and the Parkers got going on, just don't break nothing." The youngest Parker brother, a pockmarked man with yellowing teeth, yanked Penelope toward the staircase leading to the rooms upstairs. "Let's see if you're worth what your pa owes." That was enough for Mason. He drained his whiskey in one swallow, set the glass down with deliberate care, and stood. "I believe the lady said no," he stated, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieting room. The eldest Parker turned, sizing up the stranger. "This ain't your concern, mister. Best sit back down." Mason stepped forward, his spurs jingling with each measured step. "I'm making it my concern." His eyes locked with Penelope's, seeing the desperate hope flare within them. "You willing to die over some shopkeeper's daughter?" asked the middle Parker brother, his hand hovering near his pistol. "That depends," Mason replied calmly. "Are you willing to die over whatever trivial sum you claim you're owed?" The saloon had fallen silent now. Even the piano player's fingers stilled on the keys. Penelope felt the grip on her arm loosen slightly as the Parker's attention shifted to the approaching cowboy. "3 against 1 ain't good odds, stranger," sneered the eldest. Mason's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then it's a fair fight." What happened next unfolded in a blur of violence. The youngest Parker lunged, but Mason moved with surprising speed, delivering a crushing blow to the man's jaw that sent him crashing into a table. The middle brother drew his pistol, but Mason was quicker, kicking the weapon from his hand before driving his fist into the man's stomach, doubling him over. The eldest Parker, still clutching Penelope, shoved her aside and reached for his knife. She stumbled back, colliding with a chair as Mason ducked the wild slash of the blade. With calculated precision, Mason caught the man's wrist, twisted until a crack echoed through the saloon, and followed with a headbutt that dropped Parker to his knees. The entire confrontation had lasted less than a minute. The patrons of the Rusty Nail gaped at the newcomer who stood unruffled amidst three groaning men. Mason straightened his vest, scanned the room with a warning glance, then approached Penelope, who was pressed against the wall, wide-eyed and breathing hard. "Madam," he said gently, extending his hand, "I believe it's time you left this establishment." Penelope hesitated only a moment before placing her trembling hand in his. "Thank you," she whispered. The youngest Parker was struggling to his feet, reaching for a discarded bottle to use as a weapon. Without looking back, Mason sensed the movement and in one fluid motion, drew his revolver and fired, shattering the bottle inches from the man's hand. "Stay down," Mason advised coldly. "All of you." Then, with surprising gentleness, he swept Penelope into his arms and carried her toward the door. She instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt, inhaling the scent of leather, horses, and gunpowder. The saloon doors swung shut behind them, and Mason carried Penelope down the main street, ignoring the stares of townsfolk. Only when they had reached the relative safety of the general store did he set her carefully on her feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Penelope shook her head, attempting to smooth her disheveled hair. "No, just shaken." She looked up at him, really seeing her rescuer for the first time. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a day's growth of beard shadowing his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a clear, piercing blue that seemed to see right through her. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Xavier, Mason Xavier." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair with a slight wave. "And no thanks necessary, Miss Nelson, Penelope Nelson." She straightened her shoulders, reclaiming some dignity. "Those men, the Parkers, they claim my father owes them money, but it's not true. They're trying to force him out of business because he refuses to sell them goods on credit anymore." Mason nodded. "Men like that understand only one language, violence," Penelope said softly, then looked alarmed. "Oh, you could be in danger now. The Parkers have friends and the sheriff is their cousin." The hint of a smile touched Mason's lips. "I've handled worse." The bell above the store door jingled, and an older man with spectacles and thinning gray hair rushed in, his face lined with worry. "Penelope, Mrs. Finch said she saw those Parker hooligans dragging you." He stopped short at the sight of Mason. "Who's this?" "Father, this is Mr. Xavier. She swallowed hard, the reality of what might have happened hitting her anew. "He saved me from the Parkers at the saloon." Harold Nelson's face paled, then flushed with anger. "They took you to that place. Those animals." He turned to Mason, extending his hand. "Sir, I am forever in your debt." Mason accepted the handshake. "Just happened to be in the right place." "You must allow me to repay you somehow," insisted Harold. "Dinner, at least. Tonight?" Mason glanced at Penelope, noting the color returning to her cheeks and the quiet strength in her stance despite her ordeal. Something about her called to him, perhaps the same instinct that had made him intervene at the saloon. "That's kind of you, Mr. Nelson, but I'd best be moving on. The Parkers won't take kindly to what happened today." "Nonsense," Harold declared. Medicine Bow has endured the Parker brothers' reign of intimidation for too long. It's time someone stood up to them. He clasped Mason's shoulder. "Please join us for dinner. 7 o'clock. Mason hesitated, then nodded. 7 it is, then. As Mason departed, tipping his hat to Penelope, she watched him through the store window, this mysterious stranger who had appeared just when she needed him most. Something told her that Mason Xavier would change more than just this one afternoon in her life. Harold locked the door behind Mason and turned to his daughter. "Tell me everything that happened." As Penelope recounted her ordeal, leaving out the more frightening details to spare her father additional worry, she couldn't help but wonder about the cowboy who had fought for her without hesitation. Who was Mason Xavier, and what had brought him to Medicine Bow? Mason returned to his room at the modest boarding house, aware that his actions at the saloon had irrevocably altered his plans. He had intended to pass through Medicine Bow quietly, spend a night or two, then continue west. Now he had made enemies, and accepted a dinner invitation from a family he should, by all rights, have nothing to do with. He poured water from the pitcher into the basin and scrubbed his face, examining the minor cut on his knuckle from the fight. Mason had spent the last 5 years drifting, taking work where he could find it, always moving on before he could form connections. It was safer that way for everyone. But as he changed into his cleanest shirt for dinner with the Nelsons, he found himself thinking about Penelope's honey-brown hair and the determination in her eyes even as she faced danger. There had been something compelling about her, a strength that matched her beauty. At precisely 7 o'clock, Mason knocked on the Nelsons' door. The family lived in modest but comfortable rooms above the general store. Penelope herself answered, wearing a simple green dress that complemented her fair complexion. Her hair was neatly arranged, and only a faint shadow on her wrist hinted at the rough handling she had endured earlier. "Mr. Xavier," she greeted him, a smile warming her features. "Please come in." The small apartment was neat and homey, with handmade quilts and a few treasured books suggesting a family of simple but refined tastes. Harold Nelson welcomed him warmly, and Mason was introduced to Mrs. Nelson, a gentlewoman whose resemblance to Penelope was unmistakable. "We cannot thank you enough for what you did today," Mrs. Nelson said, clasping his hand between both of hers. "Our Penelope is everything to us." The dinner was simple but delicious: roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh baked bread. Mason found himself more talkative than usual, drawn out by the Nelsons' genuine interest and Penelope's perceptive questions. "What brings you to Medicine Bow, Mr. Xavier?" Harold asked as they enjoyed apple pie for dessert. "Just passing through," Mason replied. "I've been working cattle drives mostly, but I'm headed to Montana Territory. Heard there's good work there." "You've traveled widely then," Penelope observed. "I've never been further than Cheyenne myself." "The world's a big place," Mason said. "Beautiful in parts, harsh in others." "Like people," Penelope suggested. Mason's eyes met hers across the table. "Exactly like people." As the evening progressed, Mason found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. The Nelsons were good folk, honest, hardworking, and kind. The sort of family he had once dreamed of having himself, before the war and everything that followed had reshaped his life. When it came time to leave, Harold pulled Mason aside. "I hate to impose further, Mr. Xavier, but I'm concerned about the Parkers. They won't let this afternoon's humiliation go unanswered." "I was thinking the same," Mason admitted. "You might consider sending your wife and daughter to stay with relatives for a while." Harold shook his head. "We have nowhere to go, and besides, this is our home, our livelihood." "We can't abandon it," Mason nodded, understanding the older man's position. "Then I'll stay in town a bit longer than planned. Keep an eye out." "I couldn't ask that of you. You didn't ask," Mason interrupted gently. "I'm offering." Relief washed over Harold's face. "Then I accept gratefully." and I insist on paying you for your time." "We can discuss that later," Mason said, uncomfortable with the idea of taking money from the family. Penelope appeared in the hallway, holding Mason's hat. "I want to thank you again," she said, handing it to him. "Not just for this afternoon, but for agreeing to stay. I know it changes your plans." Mason settled the hat on his head. "Plans can change, Miss Nelson." "Penelope, please," she said. "And I hope—" She hesitated, a flush coloring her cheeks. "I hope we might become friends during your stay." Something warmed in Mason's chest at her words. "I'd like that, Penelope." As he walked back to his boarding house through the quiet streets of Medicine Bow, Mason remained alert, scanning doorways and rooftops for any sign of the Parkers or their associates. He knew they would come for him eventually, men like that always did. But for now, the town was peaceful under a blanket of stars, and Mason found himself looking forward to tomorrow in a way he hadn't in a very long time. The next morning, Mason rose early and positioned himself on a bench outside the general store, ostensibly whittling a piece of wood but actually keeping watch. When Penelope emerged to sweep the boardwalk, she smiled at the sight of him. "Good morning, Mr. Xavier." "Mason," he corrected, returning her smile. "If I'm calling you Penelope seems only fair." She leaned on her broom, studying him. "Have you been there long enough?" He nodded toward the street, where two men on horseback were watching the store with undisguised interest. "We have admirers." Penelope followed his gaze, her smile fading. "Friends of the Parkers. They've been riding past every half hour since we opened." "Just watching for now," Mason observed. "Testing boundaries." "It's not just my father's refusal to extend them credit, you know," Penelope said, lowering her voice. "The Parkers have been buying up properties all over town. They want to control everything from the livery stable to the hotel. Father says they're preparing for when the railroad comes through." Mason nodded. It was a familiar pattern in frontier town speculators grabbing land in anticipation of progress, often through intimidation or outright violence. "Your father seems like a principled man." "He is," Penelope agreed proudly. "Too principled for his own good sometimes." He extended credit to half the town during last winter's blizzard. Some still haven't paid, but he refuses to press them when times are hard. And the Parkers took advantage of his generosity. Exactly. They ran up a large debt and then claimed they'd already paid it. When Father insisted otherwise, they started spreading rumors that he keeps false books. Her knuckles whitened around the broom handle. "Now they're telling everyone they're going to take the store as payment." Mason's jaw tightened. "That explains yesterday." Penelope nodded, her eyes downcast. "They meant to use me to force Father's hand." Mason stood, slipping his knife back into its sheath. "They won't get the chance to try again." "You can't watch us day and night," Penelope protested. "And you shouldn't have to. This isn't your fight." "I made it my fight when I carried you out of that saloon," Mason said simply. "Besides, I don't much care for bullies." Before Penelope could respond, a wagon rattled to a stop in front of the store. A middle-aged woman in a practical gray dress climbed down, eyeing Mason suspiciously before turning to Penelope. "Morning, Mrs. Conway," Penelope greeted her. "How is Mr. Conway's rheumatism?" "No better, no worse," Mrs. Conway replied, still giving Mason sideways glances. "I need flour and sugar and some of that liniment your father stocks. Of course, please come in." Penelope held the door open, then paused to look back at Mason. "Will you be here when I'm done?" "I'll be around," he promised. Throughout the day, Mason maintained his vigil, sometimes visible on the bench, sometimes watching from across the street or from the window of the cafe. He observed the steady stream of customers entering the Nelson store, noting which one seemed genuinely friendly with Penelope and which kept their interactions strictly business. Late in the afternoon, the town's sheriff ambled toward the store. He was a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache and small, calculating eyes. Mason straightened, instinctively checking his sidearm. Sheriff Parker, the eldest Parker brothers' cousin, stopped directly in front of Mason. "You must be the troublemaker from the Rusty Nail." Mason didn't stand. "And you must be the law around here. Funny how you weren't available when 3 men were dragging a woman into a saloon against her will." The sheriff's face darkened. "Watch your tone, stranger. I don't know what happened yesterday, but I do know the Nelsons owe my cousin's money, and Jeb's got a broken wrist thanks to you." "That's so?" Mason asked mildly. "Well, if your cousins ever want to press charges, I'll be happy to testify about their attempted kidnapping and assault on Miss Nelson. I'm sure the territorial judge would be interested." The sheriff's hand twitched near his holster. "You threatening me?" "Just stating facts," Mason replied. "Now, unless you're arresting me for something specific, I believe we're done here." For a tense moment, Sheriff Parker glared at Mason, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he spat in the dust near Mason's boot. "You best be moving on, cowboy. Medicine Bow ain't friendly to your kind." "And what kind is that?" "The kind that don't know his place," the sheriff growled. "The kind that ends up face down in a ditch." Mason held the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Sounds like a threat, Sheriff. Careful now, that badge doesn't give you the right to issue those." With a final glower, Sheriff Parker moved on, pushing through the door of the general store. Mason remained outside but shifted his position to where he could see through the window. He watched as the sheriff approached Harold Nelson at the counter. Their conversation clearly heated, though he couldn't hear the words. Penelope stood nearby, her posture rigid, eyes flashing with the same determination Mason had witnessed yesterday. When the sheriff jabbed a finger toward her, Harold Nelson's normally mild demeanor transformed. The older man drew himself up to his full height and said something that made the sheriff back up a step. A few minutes later, Sheriff Parker stormed out of the store, his face mottled with anger. He shot Mason a venomous look but didn't stop. Penelope emerged shortly after, her cheeks flushed. "He threatened to shut us down," she said without preamble. "Claims we're selling adulterated goods." Mason frowned. "Can he do that?" "Not legally, but who's to stop him? He's the law here." She sat beside Mason, smoothing her apron. "Father told him if he tried, we'd write to the territorial governor. That backed him off, but only for now." "This goes beyond a simple debt," Mason observed. "It does," Penelope agreed. "The Parkers want our store because it's the largest building on the Main Street prime location for when the railroad comes. They've made offers, but Father refuses to sell." Mason watched a group of men gather outside the saloon across the street, the Parker brothers among them. "They're planning something." Penelope followed his gaze, her expression hardening. "They always are, but we won't be intimidated." She turned to him suddenly. "Why are you helping us, Mason? Truly, you don't know us." Mason considered the question, surprised by his own certainty when he answered. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because—" He hesitated, then met her eyes directly. "Because when I saw you in that saloon, something told me you were worth fighting for." The admission hung between them, more revealing than Mason had intended. Penelope's eyes widened slightly, and a soft blush crept up her neck. "Well," she said finally, her voice a touch breathless, "I'm very glad your instincts led you to intervene." Their gazes held for a long moment, and Mason felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of possibilities neither had anticipated. The moment was broken by Harold calling Penelope back into the store. She rose reluctantly. "Will you join us for dinner again tonight?" she asked. Mason nodded. "I'd be honored." 7 o'clock, she said with a smile and disappeared inside. Mason spent the rest of the afternoon making inquiries around town, building a clearer picture of the Parkers' operations. By evening, he had learned enough to concern him deeply. The brothers had systematically worked their way through the businesses of Medicine Bow, using a combination of intimidation, selective law enforcement via their cousin, and occasional violence to acquire property or control commerce. Those who had stood against them had suffered mysterious accidents or found themselves facing trumped-up charges. The town's previous doctor had left after his clinic burned down a fire officially ruled accidental, despite occurring the day after he'd refused to falsify a death certificate for the Parkers. Mason returned to his boarding house to clean up before dinner, his mind working through what he'd learned. The Parkers were more dangerous than he'd initially assessed, not just common bullies but calculating predators with a long-term strategy. And now he had placed himself squarely in their path. He checked his revolver, cleaned and loaded it carefully, then tucked it back in its holster. As he did so, his fingers brushed against the worn letter he kept in his inside pocket, his final connection to a life he'd left behind years ago. For a moment, he was tempted to read it again, but instead straightened his collar and headed for the Nelsons. Dinner that evening was more subdued than the previous night. Harold shared his concerns about the sheriff's visit, while Mrs. Nelson worried about rumors circulating that the Nelsons were selling tainted goods. "It's nonsense, of course," Harold said, passing Mason the potatoes. "But mud sticks, especially in a small town. We've lived here for 15 years, Mrs. Nelson added, built this business from nothing, and now—" She trailed off, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. Penelope reached across to squeeze her mother's hand. "We won't let them win, Mother." Mason observed the family's quiet dignity in the face of this threat. It stirred something long dormant in him, a sense of purpose, of belonging to something worth defending. "Mr. Nelson," he said, setting down his fork, "I've been asking around town today. The Parkers have been systematically taking over Medicine Bow for the past 2 years. Your store is one of the last independent businesses they don't control." Harold nodded grimly. "I'm well aware. The smithy, the livery, even the hotel, all paying protection money or partly owned by them now. But no one stands together," Mason pointed out. "Each business has faced them alone." Penelope's eyes lit with understanding. "You're suggesting an alliance." "Exactly," Mason confirmed. "The Parkers are powerful because they've isolated each of their targets. But what if the remaining business owners stood as one, refused to be intimidated?" Harold looked thoughtful. "Milligan at the hardware store, Whitaker who runs the livery, old Peterson at the smithy, they're good men, just scared." "And with good reason," Mrs. Nelson interjected. "The Parkers have hurt people, Harold." "Yes," Mason acknowledged, "and they'll hurt more if they're not stopped." Penelope studied him across the table. "This isn't just about protecting our store anymore, is it? You're talking about reclaiming the whole town." Mason met her gaze steadily. "I've seen towns like this before, one family or gang slowly choking the life out of a community. It never ends well." Harold pushed his plate away, his expression resolute. "I'll speak to Milligan tomorrow, and Peterson. They might listen. And I'll talk to Mrs. Hoffman at the cafe," Penelope added. "The Parkers have been forcing her to buy supplies through them at inflated prices." Mason nodded approvingly. "Start small, quiet conversations. We don't want the Parkers to know what we're doing until we have enough support." As they continued planning, Mason became acutely aware of how naturally he had become part of this family struggle, how "we" had replaced "you" in his thinking. It was dangerous territory for a man who had spent years avoiding attachments, yet he couldn't bring himself to pull back. After dinner, while Mrs. Nelson and Penelope cleared the dishes, Harold invited Mason to share a pipe on the small balcony overlooking the main street. The evening was cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "You're not just a cowboy passing through, are you, Mason?" Harold asked after they had smoked in silence for a few minutes. Mason took his time answering. "I was a lawman once, deputy marshal in Kansas." Harold nodded as if this confirmed a suspicion. "I thought as much. You have that look about you." "I left the badge behind a long time ago," Mason said quietly. "May I ask why?" Mason tapped his pipe against the railing, watching the ashes fall. "I trusted the wrong people, made mistakes. People died who shouldn't have." Harold was silent for a moment. "We all carry regrets, son. The question is whether we let them define our future." The door opened behind them and Penelope stepped out, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Am I interrupting?" she asked. "Not at all," Harold said, straightening. "In fact, I think I'll go help your mother with those dishes." He clapped Mason on the shoulder as he passed, leaving them alone on the balcony. Penelope moved to stand beside Mason at the railing, looking out over the town. Most buildings were dark now, except for the saloon, which glowed with lamplight and echoed with distant piano music. "It's a good town," she said softly. "Or it was before the Parkers came." Mason glanced at her profile, struck again by the quiet strength she projected. "It can be again." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "You don't have to do this, you know. You could still leave, continue to Montana as you planned. No one would blame you." "I would," Mason replied simply. Penelope studied him, the lamplight from inside casting her face in soft gold. "There's more to your story than you've told us." It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. "Yes. Will you tell me someday?" The question caught him off guard, not just its directness, but the implication of a future where they would still be in each other's lives. Mason found himself wanting that future with an intensity that surprised him. "Yes," he said again. "Someday." Penelope smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and made something in Mason's chest tighten. "I'll hold you to that promise." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the quiet town, until Mrs. Nelson called Penelope inside to help with some mending. As Penelope turned to go, her hand brushed Mason's on the railing, a touch so brief it might have been accidental, yet it left his skin tingling. "Good night, Mason," she said softly. "Good night, Penelope." As he made his way back to the boarding house later, Mason remained alert, knowing the Parkers might try to ambush him. But the streets were quiet and he reached his room without incident. Yet as he lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, Mason knew the calm wouldn't last. The Parkers would make their move soon, and when they did, he needed to be ready. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of pristine Wyoming day that made the hardships of frontier life seem worthwhile. Mason arrived at the general store early to find Harold already in conversation with Benjamin Milligan, the owner of the hardware store. The two men looked up as Mason entered, their discussion pausing. "Ah, Mason," Harold greeted him. "I was just telling Ben about our discussion last night." Milligan, a stout man with a receding hairline and cautious eyes, assessed Mason skeptically. "Nelson says you think we should band together against the Parkers." His tone suggested he found the idea preposterous. "I think it's your only chance," Mason replied evenly. "Alone, they can pick you off one by one. Together, you present a problem they can't easily solve." "You don't know what they're capable of," Milligan said, lowering his voice though the store was empty. "Last year, Jim Walters at the feed store refused to pay them. 2 days later, his place burned to the ground. Insurance wouldn't cover it, said it was arson. And did anyone stand with Walters?" Mason asked. "Or did the town just watch it happen?" Milligan looked ashamed. "What could we do? The sheriff is their cousin, I know, Mason interrupted. But there's a higher law than Sheriff Parker. The territorial governor would send marshals if he knew what was happening here. And who's going to tell him? Milligan demanded. The telegraph operator is on their payroll. Letters leaving town get lost. We're isolated here. Not completely, Harold interjected. The stage comes through twice a week. One of us could travel to Cheyenne, speak directly to the authorities. Milligan shook his head. They watch the stage. Anyone trying to leave town to seek help would be followed. Then we fight our own battle, Mason said firmly. The bell above the door jingled as Penelope entered, carrying a basket of fresh bread from the bakery. She greeted them cheerfully, then sensed the tension in the room. "Mr. Milligan, is everything all right?" Milligan's expression softened at the sight of her. "Just discussing business, Miss Nelson." He turned back to Harold. "I'll think on what we talked about, no promises." With a nod to Mason, he departed, passing Penelope with a forced smile. "He's afraid," Harold sighed once Milligan had gone. "With good reason," Mason acknowledged. "But fear can be overcome." Penelope set down her basket and joined them. "Mrs. Hoffman at the cafe is interested in our alliance. She's suffered more than most under the Parkers' control." "Good," Harold said. "That's a start at least." The day progressed slowly, with Harold and Penelope tending to customers while Mason kept watch, sometimes from inside the store, sometimes from strategic positions outside. By mid-afternoon, word had spread about Mason's continued presence at the Nelsons, and several townspeople found excuses to stop by the store, curiosity evident in their lingering gazes and whispered conversations. Around 4 o'clock, the Parker brothers made their first appearance of the day, riding slowly past the store, Jeb's broken wrist prominently bandaged. They made no move to enter, content for now with this show of intimidation. Mason watched from the window, noting how Jeb Parker's eyes swept the storefront, searching for him. "They're testing us," Penelope observed, coming to stand beside him. "Seeing if you're still here. And planning their next move," Mason added. "They won't wait much longer." As if proving his point, a boy of about 12 rushed into the store, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Mr. Nelson, they're loading barrels onto a wagon behind the Saloon kerosene barrels." Harold emerged from the back room, alarmed. "Who is Tommy?" "The Parkers and some of their men," the boy panted. "I heard them talking about making an example tonight." Mason exchanged a grim look with Harold. "They're planning to burn you out," Penelope gasped, one hand flying to her throat. "All our inventory, our home, we need to warn the others," Harold said urgently. "If they're starting with us, they won't stop here." Mason made a quick decision. "Harold, go to Milligan and the others. Tell them what's happening. Penelope, gather anything valuable or irreplaceable from your home upstairs. I'll find out exactly what the Parkers are planning." Harold hesitated. "It could be a trap." "Almost certainly is," Mason agreed. "But we need to know for sure." After a moment's consideration, Harold nodded. "Be careful. Penelope, come with me." "I'll be quicker on my own," Penelope countered. "And Mother is visiting Mrs. Peterson this afternoon. I need to warn her not to come home." Mason didn't like the idea of Penelope alone in the store, but there wasn't time to argue. "Lock the door behind me," he instructed. "Don't open it for anyone you don't absolutely trust." She nodded, her face pale but determined. "Be careful, Mason." He touched her hand briefly, a silent promise, then slipped out the door. Moving casually at first to avoid drawing attention, Mason made his way toward the Rusty Nail Saloon. Instead of approaching directly, he circled around to the back alley, staying in the shadows of buildings. Sure enough, a wagon stood behind the saloon, 3 kerosene barrels loaded onto it. 2 men Mason didn't recognize were checking the harnesses on a pair of horses, Mason crept closer, listening to their conversation. "Jeb says wait till midnight," one man was saying, "when the town's asleep." "What about the cowboy?" asked the other. "He's been watching the place like a hawk." "Sheriff's taking care of him. Got a warrant for his arrest, assault charges from the fight at the saloon. He'll be locked up before sundown." Mason backed away quietly. He needed to warn the Nelsons and get them to safety before the sheriff came for him. As he turned to leave, his boot crunched on broken glass. Both men whirled around. "Hey, who's there?" Mason didn't wait. He sprinted down the alley, hearing shouts behind him. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood near his head. He ducked around a corner, drew his revolver, and waited. When the first pursuer rounded the corner, Mason struck him with the butt of his gun, dropping the man unconscious to the ground. The second man skidded to a halt, raising his pistol, but Mason was faster. His shot caught the man in the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a howl of pain. Mason didn't stay to see more. He ran toward the general store, knowing the gunshots would bring others, including possibly the sheriff. When he reached the store, he found the door locked as instructed. He pounded on it. "Penelope, it's Mason." The door opened immediately, and Penelope pulled him inside, locking it behind him. "I heard shots. They saw me," Mason explained quickly. "They're planning to burn the store tonight at midnight, and the sheriff is coming to arrest me on false charges before then." Penelope's eyes widened in alarm. "We need to get you out of town." "Not without you and your parents," Mason insisted. "Once I'm gone, nothing will stop the Parkers from coming after you." "Father went to gather support," Penelope said. "He thinks if enough townspeople stand together tonight—" "There isn't time for that," Mason interrupted. "The sheriff could be here any minute. We need to leave now, find somewhere safe until we can figure out our next move." Penelope hesitated, clearly torn between flight and standing their ground. "Everything we have is here, Mason. Everything we've worked for. And none of it matters if you're not alive to enjoy it," Mason replied, his voice softening as he took her hands in his. "Penelope, please trust me." She looked up at him, searching his face, then nodded. "I trust you. Let me get the money from the safe and a few essentials." While Penelope gathered what they needed from upstairs, Mason kept watch through the window. The street remained normal for now, but he knew it wouldn't last. They needed to slip away before the sheriff organized a search party. Penelope returned quickly, a small carpet bag in hand. "I've left a note for Father explaining where we've gone." "And where is that?" Mason asked. "My uncle has a hunting cabin about 5 miles north of town," Penelope explained. "Father and I are the only ones who know exactly where it is. We'll be safe there." Mason nodded approvingly. "We'll need horses. There's a back entrance to the livery. Tom Whitaker will help us. He's no friend of the Parkers." They slipped out the back door of the store and made their way through back alleys toward the livery stable. Twice, they had to duck into doorways to avoid search parties, but eventually reached the stable undetected. Tom Whitaker, a lanky man with a perpetual stoop, listened to their hurried explanation with a grave expression. "Damn Parkers," he muttered. "Been waiting for something like this." He led them to 2 saddled horses. "Take these. The bay mare is gentle, miss, but she's got stamina." "We can't pay you now," Mason began, but Whitaker waved him off. "Consider it my contribution to the cause. Just don't get caught and come back when you can." Minutes later, they were riding north out of town, taking a rarely used trail that would keep them hidden from the main road. Penelope rode confidently, her skirts hiked up in a most unladylike fashion to accommodate the saddle. Despite the danger of their situation, Mason found himself admiring her adaptability and courage. They rode hard for nearly an hour, putting distance between themselves and Medicine Bow, before Penelope led them off the trail into thicker woods. The terrain became more challenging, with the horses picking their way carefully over rocky ground and through dense undergrowth. "Not much further," Penelope assured him as the light began to fade. "The cabin is just beyond that ridge." True to her word, they soon came upon a small log cabin nestled in a clearing, a stream gurgling nearby. It was rustic but solid, with a stone chimney and small porch. "Uncle George built it for hunting trips," Penelope explained as they dismounted. "He passed away 2 years ago, but Father keeps it maintained." Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable, with a main room containing a table, chairs, and a stone fireplace, and a smaller room in the back with a bed. Shelves held preserved food and essential supplies. "Your father thinks of everything," Mason observed, noting the well-stocked woodpile and emergency provisions. "He believes in being prepared," Penelope agreed, lighting a lamp. After losing the farm in Ohio to floods, he never wanted to be caught vulnerable again. As Penelope busied herself starting a fire in the hearth, Mason checked the perimeter of the cabin, ensuring they hadn't been followed and familiarizing himself with potential defensive positions. The location was well chosen, elevated enough to see approaching visitors, with the stream providing both water and a natural boundary on one side. When he returned inside, Penelope had a small fire going and was heating water for coffee. The warm light cast a golden glow over the cabin, making it feel surprisingly homelike despite their circumstances. "You think Father and Mother are safe?" Penelope asked, her composure finally cracking to reveal her worry. Mason sat across from her at the table. "Your father is smart. He'll have realized we left for safety and done the same. The Parkers want your property, not your lives. But they wouldn't hesitate to hurt us to get what they want," Penelope pointed out. "No," Mason agreed soberly. "They wouldn't." They sat in silence for a moment, the reality of their situation settling over them. Finally, Penelope poured the coffee into 2 tin cups. "What happens now?" she asked. "We can't hide here forever." "No," Mason agreed, "but we can buy time. By morning, your father will have either rallied enough support in town to stand against the Parkers, or he'll join us here. Either way, we'll have more options than we did an hour ago." Penelope nodded, wrapping her hands around her cup for warmth. "Thank you, Mason, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," he cautioned. "We're not out of this." "Still," she insisted, "you could have ridden on, left our problems behind you. Instead, you've risked everything for people you barely know." Mason studied her across the table, taking in her determined eyes, the stubborn set of her chin, the way the firelight played on her honey-brown hair. In just 3 days, Penelope Nelson had come to mean more to him than anyone had in years. "Some things are worth the risk," he said quietly. Their eyes met and held, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Penelope's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. "Mason," she began, her voice softer than before. A distant sound interrupted her, the whinny of a horse, somewhere in the woods. Mason was on his feet instantly, extinguishing the lamp while Penelope quickly banked the fire to reduce its light. "Someone's coming," Mason whispered, drawing his revolver. "Stay low, away from the windows." They waited in tense silence, straining to hear. After a moment, a voice called out, not threatening but familiar. "Penny, are you there? It's Father." Penelope sagged with relief. "It's him." She moved toward the door, but Mason held her back. "Wait," he cautioned. "Let's be sure he's alone." "Penelope," Harold's voice came again. "If you're there, it's safe to answer. I'm alone." Mason nodded, and Penelope opened the door. Harold Nelson rode into the clearing, dismounting quickly and embracing his daughter as soon as she ran to him. "Thank God you're safe," Harold said, holding her tight. "When I found your note, I prayed you'd gotten away in time." "We did," Penelope assured him, But what about Mother? Is she safe? Yes, Harold nodded. She's with the Whitacres. Tom's wife took her in when the sheriff started searching for Mason. He turned to Mason, extending his hand. Thank you for protecting my daughter. Mason clasped the offered hand. What's happening in town? Harold's expression turned grim. The Parkers have gathered their men. They're planning to burn us out tonight, as you discovered, but the town is finally standing up to them. Milligan, Peterson, Hoffman, they've all realized they could be next. They're organizing to defend the store. Against armed men, Mason asked skeptically. That's a bloodbath waiting to happen. They're not alone, Harold said. The stage brought in a U.S. Marshal this afternoon, pure luck, but he's deputized several men already. The Parkers don't know yet. Mason's eyebrows rose in surprise. A marshal? Here for what? Land fraud investigation, Harold explained. Apparently the Parkers have been filing false claims on government land. The timing couldn't be better. Mason considered this new information. So the law is finally on our side. For now, Harold nodded. But the marshal wants you to come in, Mason. There are questions about the shooting in the alley. I had no choice, Mason began, but Harold raised a hand. I know that. And I believe the marshal will too once he hears the full story, but he wants to speak with you directly. Penelope looked alarmed. It could be a trap. The sheriff has been temporarily relieved of duty, Harold said with satisfaction. The marshal's first act upon hearing about the situation in town. Mason and Penelope exchanged a look of cautious optimism. When does the marshal want to see me? Mason asked. As soon as possible, Harold replied. He's organizing men at the town hall now, preparing to confront the Parkers before they can carry out their plan tonight. Mason nodded decisively. Then we ride back now. I'm coming too, Penelope declared. Absolutely not, Harold and Mason said in unison. This is my home too, Penelope insisted. I won't hide in the woods while others fight for it. Mason recognized the determined set of her jaw and knew argument would be futile. Besides, with a marshal and deputized townsmen, the danger was significantly reduced. Stay close to your father, he conceded. And at the first sign of trouble, you find cover. They quickly readied the horses and set off for Medicine Bow, Harold leading the way. The ride back seemed shorter, perhaps because they weren't fleeing in fear this time but returning with purpose. As they approached town, Mason could see unusual activity, men with rifles positioned on rooftops. Others gathered in small groups on street corners. The town hall, normally quiet at this hour, blazed with light. Harold led them directly there, where they were met at the door by a tall, weathered man with a silver badge on his chest, Marshal James Harker. Nelson, the marshal greeted Harold, then turned his steely gaze to Mason. And you must be Xavier. Yes, sir, Mason confirmed. I understand you've been stirring up quite a hornet's nest in my jurisdiction, the marshal said, his tone neutral. Not by choice, Mason replied evenly. The marshal studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. Come inside. We have matters to discuss before the Parkers make their move. Inside the town hall, about 20 men were gathered, including Milligan, Whitaker, and other business owners Mason recognized from the store. They looked nervous but determined, many armed with shotguns or rifles. Mason, Tom Whitaker called out. Glad to see you made it back. Thought you might be halfway to Montana by now, and miss all this excitement, Mason replied with a wry smile. Marshal Harker led them to a table where a map of the town was spread out. The Parkers and about 10 men are gathered at the Saloon, he explained. According to our information, they plan to move against the Nelson store at midnight. We'll intercept them before they can get that far. What about Sheriff Parker? Mason asked. Locked in his own jail, the marshal said with grim satisfaction. Resisting a federal officer tends to have that effect. For the next hour, they refined their plan. The marshal would confront the Parkers directly with a warrant for their arrest on federal charges, backed by armed townsmen positioned strategically throughout the main street. If the Parkers resisted, they would be contained and overwhelmed by superior numbers. "Our goal is to take them alive to stand trial," Marshal Harker emphasized. "This isn't about revenge, it's about justice." As midnight approached, the men took their positions. Harold insisted that Penelope remain at the town hall with Mrs. Hoffman and several other women, well away from potential danger. Though she protested, one look at her father's face convinced her to acquiesce. Before Mason left to take his position, Penelope pulled him aside. "Be careful," she whispered, her eyes bright with worry. "I'm not ready to lose you yet." The simple declaration sent warmth spreading through Mason's chest. "You won't," he promised, and impulsively pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead before following the marshal out. The confrontation, when it came, was both more and less dramatic than anticipated. Marshal Harker, Mason, and 5 deputized townsmen approached the saloon openly, while others maintained positions covering all exits and potential escape routes. The street was eerily quiet, the usual saloon piano silenced in anticipation of the night's planned violence. Marshal Harker pushed through the batwing doors without hesitation, his voice ringing out clearly. "Jeb Parker, you and your brothers are under arrest for land fraud, attempted arson, and conspiracy against the United States government." The scene inside froze the Parker brothers at a table with their men, clearly in the midst of final preparations. Kerosene-soaked rags lay piled beside loaded weapons. Jeb Parker, his broken wrist still bandaged, slowly stood. "This is a local matter, Marshal. You have no jurisdiction here." "Federal crimes mean federal jurisdiction," Harker replied calmly. "Are you surrendering peacefully, or do we do this the hard way?" The youngest Parker brother reached for his gun, but Mason was faster, firing a shot that sent the weapon spinning from the man's hand. "Next one won't be so considerate," Mason warned. For a tense moment, it seemed the Parkers might choose violence. But surrounded, outnumbered, and facing federal charges, even Jeb Parker recognized the futility of resistance. With a nod to his brothers, he raised his hands in surrender. "This ain't over," he growled as Marshal Harker handcuffed him. "We got friends in high places." "So do we," Harold Nelson said from the doorway. "The whole town stands together now." The Parkers and their men were disarmed and marched to the jail, where they would await transport to Cheyenne for trial. As the townsfolk watched them led away, a sense of disbelief gave way to cautious celebration. For the first time in years, Medicine Bow was free of the Parkers' shadow. Back at the town hall, Penelope flew into her father's arms when they returned, then turned to Mason with shining eyes. "Is it truly over?" "The immediate threat, yes," Mason confirmed. "The marshal will take them to Cheyenne for trial. With federal charges and multiple witnesses, they'll be away for a long time." The celebration continued well into the night, with townspeople sharing stories of the Parkers' intimidation and expressing relief at their downfall. Mason found himself the center of much attention and gratitude, a position that made him distinctly uncomfortable. Eventually, he slipped outside for some air, leaning against the railing of the town hall's porch. Penelope found him there, offering a cup of coffee. "Hiding from your admirers," Mason accepted the cup with a small smile. "I'm not much for crowds." "No," she agreed, leaning on the railing beside him. "You prefer to watch from the edges, I've noticed." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the now peaceful town. "What happens now?" Penelope asked finally. "For you, I mean." Mason considered the question. His original plan to continue to Montana seemed distant now, irrelevant somehow. In just a few days, Medicine Bow and its people, one person in particular, had become more important to him than anywhere he'd been in years. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I hadn't thought beyond tonight." Penelope turned to face him, her expression open and vulnerable. "Would you consider staying? Medicine Bow could use a man like you. Father could use help with the store and, Mason prompted when she hesitated. "And I would like you to stay," she finished simply. Mason set down his coffee cup and took her hand in his. "Penelope, I'm not the settling type. Haven't been for a long time." Disappointment flashed across her face, but she nodded bravely. "I understand." "No, you don't," Mason continued gently. "What I mean is, I haven't been the settling type. But then I saw a woman being dragged into a saloon against her will, and something changed." He lifted his free hand to lightly touch her cheek. "You changed something in me." Hope replaced disappointment in Penelope's eyes. "Mason." "I can't promise I'll be any good at staying in one place," he warned. "But I'd like to try. Here. With you." The smile that illuminated Penelope's face was worth every risk he'd taken, every uncertainty that still lay ahead. She stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his chest. "That's all I ask," she whispered. "That you try." Mason lowered his head, and this time his kiss found her lips instead of her forehead. Penelope responded with a sweetness and passion that made his heart race, her arms sliding around his neck as she pressed closer. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I think," Mason said softly, "I'm going to be very good at trying." The following week saw Medicine Bow transform. With the Parkers gone, businesses began to thrive again. A town meeting elected Tom Whitaker as interim sheriff, until a proper election could be held. The general store became a focal point for the community once more, with Harold Nelson's fair practices and honest dealings setting the tone for a renewed spirit of cooperation. Mason found himself unexpectedly content with small-town life. He helped Harold in the store, made repairs to their building that had been neglected during the Parker years, and gradually earned the trust and respect of the townsfolk. In the evenings, he often joined the Nelsons for dinner, afterwards sitting on the porch with Penelope, talking late into the night. They spoke of everything: his years as a deputy marshal in Kansas, the tragedy that had sent him drifting westward, her dreams of someday seeing more of the world beyond Wyoming. Slowly, the walls Mason had built around himself began to crumble under Penelope's gentle persistence. One evening in late summer, as they walked along the stream that ran behind the town, Mason finally told her the full story he had promised that night on her balcony. He spoke of his time enforcing the law in Dodge City, of the outlaw gang he'd pursued for months, and of his partner's betrayal that had led to the deaths of innocent people. "I trusted him," Mason said, skipping a stone across the water. "Never questioned his loyalty. Then I found out he'd been taking money from the very men we were supposed to be hunting." "That wasn't your fault," Penelope said gently. "The deaths were," Mason countered. 3 homesteaders, a man, his wife, their 12-year-old son. They died because my partner warned the gang we were coming." His voice roughened with remembered pain. "I should have seen it, should have known." Penelope took his hand, her touch anchoring him to the present. "And that's why you've been running, because you couldn't save them." Mason nodded slowly. "That, and because I didn't want to risk trusting anyone again, caring about anyone." "Yet here you are," Penelope observed softly. "Here I am," he agreed, turning to face her, "because sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it." The look in Penelope's eyes told him she understood exactly what he meant. Standing there beside the stream, with the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Mason knew with absolute certainty that his wandering days were over. 2 months after the Parkers' arrest, on a crisp October morning, Mason Xavier and Penelope Nelson were married in the small church in Medicine Bow. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which lasted well into the evening. Harold, who had quickly come to regard Mason as the son he'd never had, gave the bride away with proud tears in his eyes. Mrs. Nelson, overjoyed to see her daughter so happy, had sewn Penelope's wedding dress herself, a creation of ivory satin and lace that made Mason's breath catch when he first saw her walking down the aisle. After the wedding, they moved into a small house just down the street from the general store. Though modest, it was their own, purchased with Mason's savings and Harold's generous wedding gift. Together they made it a home, filling it with simple furnishings, books, and the warmth of their growing love. Mason continued working with Harold at the store, gradually taking on more responsibility as the business expanded. The railroad finally came to Medicine Bow the following spring, bringing new opportunities and challenges. Thanks to Harold's foresight in securing their property legally, the Nelson store was perfectly positioned to benefit from the increased traffic, becoming a key supplier for both townspeople and travelers. Penelope, meanwhile, started a small school in one room of the church, teaching the town's children basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Her natural patience and intelligence made her an excellent teacher, and soon parents from outlying homesteads were sending their children to town for her lessons. The Parkers were convicted of multiple federal crimes and sentenced to lengthy prison terms in the territorial prison. Medicine Bow slowly healed from their influence, with new businesses opening and a sense of community pride replacing the fear that had gripped the town for so long. A year after their wedding, Penelope gave birth to a son, whom they named William Harold Xavier. Mason, who had once believed he would never have a family, found himself transformed by fatherhood, discovering depths of love and protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. As he stood in their bedroom, watching Penelope nurse their newborn son, Mason reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought him to Medicine Bow that day 2 years earlier. Had he arrived an hour later, or chosen a different saloon, or decided to mind his own business as so many others had, his life would have taken an entirely different path. "What are you thinking about?" Penelope asked, looking up to find him watching her with a tender expression. "How lucky I am," he replied simply. "How one moment changed everything," Penelope smiled, understanding immediately, "when you carried me out of that saloon." "Yes." Mason sat beside her on the bed, gently touching his son's tiny hand. "I thought I was just doing what any decent man would do. I had no idea I was actually saving myself." "We saved each other," Penelope corrected softly, "and now we have him to save too." Mason leaned forward to kiss her, then pressed another kiss to his son's downy head. "Best job I've ever had." In the years that followed, their family grew. A daughter, Rose Elizabeth, joined them 2 years after William, with her mother's honey-brown hair and her father's blue eyes. Mason eventually took over full management of the store when Harold decided to semi-retire, though the older man still came in most days to chat with customers and offer advice. Medicine Bow prospered with the railroad, growing from a small frontier settlement into a proper town with a school building, a bank, and even a small newspaper. Mason was elected to the town council, his straightforward honesty and fairness making him a respected voice in local governance. Penelope became the head teacher at the expanded school, beloved by students and parents alike. They never forgot how their story began with an act of courage and intervention that had seemed small at the time, but had changed the course of many lives. They told their children the story when they were old enough to understand, emphasizing that standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous, was the true measure of character. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Mason surprised Penelope with a trip to Denver, her first journey on the railroad she had watched being built. They spent a week exploring the growing city, attending the theater, and enjoying the novelty of fine restaurants. But by the end, both were eager to return to Medicine Bow, to their children, and to the life they had built together. As their train approached the familiar station, Penelope squeezed Mason's hand. "Thank you for Denver," she said. "It was wonderful to see more of the world at last." "We could see more if you want," Mason offered. "San Francisco, Chicago, even New York someday." Penelope smiled, shaking her head slightly. "Someday, perhaps, but I've discovered something about myself, Mason." "What's that?" "The world is fascinating to visit, but home." She looked out the window as the Medicine Bow station came into view, where they could see William and Rose jumping up and down with excitement, Harold and Mrs. Nelson standing behind them. "Home is where my heart truly wants to be." Mason followed her gaze, a profound contentment washing over him. "Mine too," he said softly, "and to think I might have missed it entirely if I hadn't happened to be in that saloon on that particular day." "It wasn't chance," Penelope said with quiet certainty. "Some things are simply meant to be." As the train pulled into the station, and their children's excited voices called out to them, Mason Xavier, once a drifter, now a husband, father, and respected businessman, silently thanked whatever fate, chance, or divine intervention had placed him in that saloon at that moment. The day he had fought 3 men and carried Penelope Nelson to safety had been the day his real life began. And in all the years that followed, through joys and sorrows, challenges and triumphs, neither of them ever had cause to doubt that they had found exactly where, and with whom, they belonged.